RadioColusa.com.
Welcome to the August episode of A Garden Runs Through It, a podcast of the UC Master Gardener program of Colusa County, produced by RadioColusa.com. I'm Gerry Hernandez, your host and coordinator of the Colusa County program. Our August and September episodes will be focused on the drought in your garden. But first, let's talk about gardening chores and upcoming events. July is coming to an end and August brings some gardening chores. What should we be doing in our garden this month? You can plant directly into the garden seeds of carrots, beets, lettuce, spinach, and turnips. You're like, why are we planting stuff in August? Well, that's when you get your winter garden going. Indoors, you could start seeds of broccoli, cabbage, kale, bunching onions, and radicchio. And believe it or not, in September, you're going to put them in the ground. Continue to weed. Those pesky weeds, you need to get them before they flower and set seeds. Cut off spent flowers of perennials and annuals for continued bloom. Water before 10 a.m. to avoid fungal infections and minimize water loss to evaporation. Check the mulch you have spread around and be sure it is thick enough to suppress weeds. That's 3 to 4 inches. Now let's talk about the drought and what you can do to save water in your garden. The long-range forecast for this winter is bleak. They are predicting another below-average year for rain. I sure hope they're wrong. As I drive around the county, I see residents irrigating their lawns and letting the water run into the gutters. This needs to stop. If you think the city wells can't go dry, think again. It can happen. On today's episode, I'm joined with Master Gardeners Cynthia, Danny, Bonnie, and Penny. Cynthia, tell us about yourself.
Well, the biggest thing about me right now is concern for what's happening in our yards and with the trees that we love to see and that people always remark about when they come into Colusa.
Tell us about saving your trees during the drought.
Your trees in your yard are one of the biggest investments you'll ever make. You know, we think about, paying a couple $100,000 for a house or whatever, or $500,000 or $1 million for heaven's sakes, and never think about the things that keep that house from just looking like another place on the block. And one of the things that does make it different and make it special for us is the trees and the landscaping that we use. The landscaping doesn't take nearly as much, but the trees need our help. We're in not the first year of a drought. We're in the second major year of a drought. And we don't know how many more years that might be. It might be a 2-year drought, and we'll be lucky next summer or next winter. Or it could be one that drags on for 5 or 6 or 10 or even 20 years. Unless we end up in better shape in 20 years than we are right now, we're going to have a serious issue saving the trees that insulate us from the sun, they clean up our air, and they make our community what we want to live in. One of the things that they've found nationally is that when you go to large cities, if you look for the nicer areas of town, and I say that with tongue in cheek, you're going to mostly find that they've got trees. And that's become one of the issues that has separated us in our communities. Those areas that had the money to put them in originally, care for them as they came along. Think about driving into Sacramento and going into William Land Park. What's the first thing you think about? This beautiful canopied area. Well, it's also one of the most well-endowed areas of Sacramento as far as the socioeconomic status. And it's also well-endowed with a canopy of trees that probably saves 10 to 20% a month off their air conditioning. Anybody that was here a week or two ago and experienced those temperatures of 110, 112, 114, if you had trees in your yard, it saved you more money than you can even think about. I'm constantly annoyed at people who say, well, I want to water my trees, but, I don't want to water that property that belongs to the city. It's not mine, and I shouldn't have to water it out there, but I do want my trees to live. And at the same time, they turn around and go to their nearby coffee shop and blow $6 on an iced coffee. I'm not quite sure I understand the economics of that, but at the same time, it does say something about who we are.
I read an article recently about exactly what you were just saying, how more affluent areas have trees and not affluent areas don't have trees.
Yeah, and to make it even worse, in those areas of those cities where people have abandoned houses and they've literally been removed, they also removed any trees that happen to be in the area, which makes it even more of a blighted area than it was just losing the homes in those areas. The tree experts know that we are in such a much better place when we can step outside our door and not have our brains be cooked in the first 5 minutes that we're out there. We've been lucky the last few days because we've lost what they're terming now as a heat dome. So we worked in the yard all morning today, and it was very pleasant. A week ago, we couldn't have done that. It would have done past about 8:30 in the morning. And if you're worried about spending $1 or $2 a month to keep your mow strip area watered, and that area belongs to the city, and if that irritates you, then think about the benefits that those trees, most of which you probably didn't even plant, somebody else planted those for you. When our granddaughter used to come and spend the summers with us when she was smaller, we talked a lot about the people in Portugal and how they're very concerned that what they grow in their yards can help them through tough times. And at the back of their lots, they always have fruit trees that they can pick things off of, have special fruits, have just common fruits, anything. It helps them in their health, and it helps them to survive in times that might be hard. So she got all excited about the fact that we grow food. So I was out doing some planting one day, and she looked at me and she goes, gee, she said, what's that going to produce? And I said, well, there'll be some gorgeous flowers that'll bloom this fall. She said, no, what's the food? And she was quite concerned in all of her 6-year-old wisdom that I wasn't growing a food plant. So there's all kinds of things. There's all kinds of additions that we can make. But one of the things that we have to add this year is enough water to keep our tree landscapes going. They need our help. They can't do it on their own. They can compensate for a lot of things, but they can't compensate for the kind of drought that we're facing.
So, Cynthia, how do we water our trees? And does it make it a difference if it's a small tree, a young tree, a large landscape tree?
It makes a lot of difference. The large landscape trees can survive a little bit better. The new trees, anything less than 5 years old, you not only have to give it additional water, you have to give it more water than you would think, just because it's still in that establishing stage. Without the water, the bigger trees will survive. They're not going to be healthy. They're not going to put on any growth. They're not going to be able to take up the food and nutrients from the ground because the ground gets hard if it's not wet. One of the things that we've talked to the city people about is we're having trouble scarring the bottoms of the trees when they were doing the weed eating. And I said, there shouldn't be any grass within 2 feet of any tree trunk. And they looked at me like I was a little wacko. And I said, because the tree doesn't need the grass, and the grass robs the nutrients that the tree really needs. And if you're 2 feet away, you don't have to worry about your string trimmer damaging the bark of a new or an old tree. And then you can put mulch on it. It can be any kind of mulch. You can grind up leaves in the fall and kind of compost them a little bit and spread them around your trees. They'll love it. It insulates them from the heat, just like when you put a hat on your head. The other thing that it will do is it discourages any of the grasses that you don't want. when you take away that lawn area within 2 feet of your tree, it's going to make all the nutrients you put out there go to the tree and not to the grass, because grass is greedy. It takes more water than anything in your yard. I've systematically eliminated about 75% of the grass in my yard, and we don't miss it. Our dog kind of does, but she gets over it. This is not a good time to be out pruning in things on your trees either. They're already under stress with the heat, and when you prune a tree, it gives it a signal. It's like it's time to grow. And you may not know that, but it's that inbred cycle that the tree has, and it knows when it gets trimmed off, that means it has to replace that. So don't trim your trees right now. If you have a soaker hose and you don't have an automatic sprinkler system, then take that soaker hose and wind it around the tree, not right at the base, but out a ways so that it can get the roots of your tree extend out as far as the longest branch. Now think about that. It's not just within that first 2 feet. It goes out. If you've got a tree that's 40 feet wide, the roots extend out that far. And when you make sure that that 40-foot area is getting water, your tree's going to be happy and it will survive and it will thrive. So those are the biggest tips on our trees.
So you have the soaker hose. How long do you run the soaker hose around your tree?
The easiest thing to do is if you've got an old screwdriver, I wouldn't suggest grabbing a brand new screwdriver to do it. Stick it down in the soil. You can get some really fancy instruments that'll do the same thing, but just a plain old screwdriver. If you can stick it into the ground 6 inches near the drip line where you've been watering, that's really good. And that says that the water is permeated. We've got pretty thick soil here. It's a clay type soil. So getting water down into the subsurface is not as easy as it is if you've got a lot of loam. So if the soil is moist all the way down, then your tree's probably in good shape for at least 5 to 7 days. If the soil is still hard and you can't get that screwdriver in there 6 inches easily, and I'm not talking about, driving it in with a hammer. I'm talking about sticking it down in. Put the water back on and let it soak a little bit longer. It'll just go into the ground if you're using a soaker. If you use a sprinkler that's splashing water everywhere, you're going to lose so much of the water that you're trying to put on it. You can add a small amount of a slow-acting fertilizer, but it's really not necessary. The trees have already taken up most of the nutrients, and here again, we don't want to spur them on to put on a lot of new growth, because that just takes that much more water to support. Roots need water, but they also have to have oxygen. So don't think that you can set that soaker hose before you go to bed at night, let it run all night long. What you'll end up with is a bog, and that moisture will saturate the soil just as if you've put your face into the tub of water and didn't come up for air. The water will drown the roots just as easily as it'll drown your nose.
Now, I think you told me something about with young trees and a bucket.
That's just kind of fun. You can enlist your grandkids to help you with this, too. Get a 5-gallon bucket, one of those old buckets that, you can buy them at Home Depot, or you can get them with paint that's been in it, as long as they're clean. And drill a hole near the bottom of the bucket.
Just one hole?
Just one hole is plenty. Then set the bucket underneath the tree at the edge of the drip line. So if your tree is, let's say, 5 feet wide, you would put it about 2.5 feet away from the trunk. Fill it with water and let the water roll out on its own. And I'm not talking about putting a golf ball size hole. I'm talking about, maybe a 1/2 inch across, because you want that to ooze out. So you got 1/4 of your tree done now. So move it 1/4 of the way around this tree, about the same distance. Fill it up with water again. Let it ooze out. It's not going to take you all day. And if you set the timer, it'll remind you to go back out and fill that bucket back up. Because every time I leave the water running or do something and coming back in the house, you get busy and you forget. So set your little timer. It's a good reminder. And it's also a good reminder of what you're about. So a 5-gallon bucket in 4 different locations around your tree, and it'll take care of that small tree.
Thank you, Cynthia. Anything else about irrigating trees during the drought?
Well, mulch is really important. You can use a lot of different things for mulch. When you see somebody out grinding out an old stump, you can actually get a couple of bucketfuls of that and put it around your trees. It also discourages grass and weed growth because you don't want that right next to the tree. You can use decomposed granite, but it's also going to make it hotter in that area. Rocks will do the same thing. A lot of people want to use weed blocking fabric or artificial turf. Well, that's a little bit hard for the water to permeate, and it really isn't a good idea to put that around your trees. So just use something that water's going to go through. So keep it 4 inches away from the trunk and layer it 6 inches thick. 6 inches. A year from now, you'll wonder where your mulch went, unless you blow it away with your leaf blower, which is it's never a good idea. If you've got a mature tree in your yard, you can figure that it's probably going to cost you $2 or $3 a month to keep it watered. That won't get you a Starbucks coffee.
Thank you, Cynthia, for those tips.
Sure.
Danny, tell us about yourself.
Okay, I've lived in Maxwell all my life. I'm 66 years old. I've been a master gardener now for about a year. I was taught in Butte County to be a master gardener, and now I'm a master gardener in Colusa County. I say there's a little difference. They are, I want to say, environmentalist tree huggers. They never spray. They never burn. They do things differently than we do here in Colusa County. I worked at Comet Rice, United Rice, American Rice, Colusa Glen Rice Dryer for about 31 years. And then we moved down to ADM, and I was down there for 4 years. And then I had my midlife crisis and decided to go get a badge, and I became a correctional officer. And we moved up to Oregon, and my wife lived there for about 2 years, and I lived there for 2 years and 7 months because I had a hard time getting back down to Vacaville where I wanted to be, California Medical Facility. I was at Pelican Bay for about 2 years and 7 months. Once I came back, I became a master gardener because I was tired of crossing my fingers and wondering what was going on. I wanted to learn, if you put a seed in the ground, why did it grow or not grow?
And Danny's working a lot with the demonstration garden.
Yeah, I do enjoy the demonstration garden. I will say the demonstration garden looks great. The tomatoes are like I used to grow. Everything else and it may be because of drip irrigation.
So Danny, that's the perfect segue. Tell us about irrigating fruit and vegetables during a drought.
Well, I will say the most efficient way to irrigate is drip irrigation. But I'm so tight I squeak, but it does cost some money initially. Most vegetables require at least 1 inch of water during the growing season. That's hard to regulate without using drip irrigation. 3/4 gallon water per plant. And we were just talking about how watering trees, we've had about 3 days of cool weather, and the trees will do better if their roots are moist. And I love bucket with a hole in it because that's truly drip irrigation, but it's cost effective. I got to try that. I will say one of the problems with the drought situation is everybody sees their plants suffering, so they over-fertilize. And you don't need much fertilizer, especially in a drought. The other thing I worry about is how long is this drought going to last? My personal feeling is we're in El Nino, and the currents are cooler, actually, and it causes the jet stream to change, and we don't get the rain we got. I think we need an El Nino that will give us the late spring rains like we used to get in March and April. When I became master gardener, I brought a 2-foot probe because I was tired of asking, is my ground wet enough or not? So I do have an irrigation probe or moisture probe that goes down in a foot into the ground 2 feet. I read that you can use a regular pole and push it down along trees, but I don't think that helps you, or you can dig up along your plants and see if you have any moisture. I just assume, or I enjoy using the probe a little more often than that. The other thing is soaker hose, and it's a form of drip irrigation too. Now in my own garden, I have raised beds, and I like that much better because I'm of the age I don't want to bend over as much, and it's easy to set up for drip irrigation. I would think you want to water just the things you truly love to grow. If it's cucumbers and tomatoes, or if it's flowers, that's what you want to spend your time on watering. And water is one of the greatest commodities we have, and we use 90% of it for farming and edibles.
Thank you, Danny. Bonnie, tell us about yourself.
Sure. My name is Bonnie Rose, and I live in Arbuckle. I've been there about 23 years, and I've been a master gardener for about 6 years. It was something I wanted to do for a long time, and I finally was able to do it.
Tell us about mulch.
All right. So I'm sure everyone has heard the word mulch, but you may or may not know what it actually means. And mulch actually is just material that is spread around plants or sometimes on top of them. But the purpose of mulch is mainly to improve soil conditions. And we're kind of talking about drought kinds of things. So one of the important things that mulch does is it locks in moisture, and it insulates the soil from extreme temperatures like 114 degrees. It keeps weeds down, and it prevents the soil from being compacted. And another reason that's really important to some people is that it actually kind of improves the appearance of your garden. It kind of makes it look all neat and tidy. There are a couple of different kinds of mulch. There's organic mulch, which includes wood chips, bark, evergreen needles, leaves and grass clippings, compost mixes, newspaper and cardboard. And all of these organic materials decompose, and so they do need to be replenished. And it depends on what the material is, how often that needs to happen. Then another type of mulch is inorganic mulch, and those are things that don't decompose, and that would be things like rock. Some people actually use pulverized rubber, which can be good in some conditions like playgrounds and things and walkways. Lava stone, landscape fabrics. Organic mulch is usually preferred by most gardeners. Wood chips and bark can be used around trees and shrubs and in perennial beds. Usually the wood chips and bark are aged and dried. Some cities offer freshly ground up tree mulch from the tree prunings that cities do. I don't think Colusa does that. But so if you ever are in a place where that's offered, it's not dried or aged, so it will leach some nitrogen from the soil as it decomposes. So you just have to be careful where you use that. You don't want to use wood chips and bark around or in vegetable gardens, places that are going to be dug up and replanted, because you just have to move the wood chips and then put them back. So another organic material that's used frequently is straw, and some people get straw and hay mixed up. You don't want to use hay because it has seeds in it, which will sprout, and you'll have grains growing in your lawn. So people do use like the thin layers of straw when they seed lawns, which is what we're not really doing a lot of these days. So grass clippings and leaves, another organic kind of mulch, that is a good thing to be using in garden beds, used around trees and shrubs. And you don't want to put it on too thickly or it will mat. I'm sure if you use a lawnmower, you've seen the mats of grass that come out of a lawnmower. And you definitely don't want to use grass or leaves that have been sprayed with any kind of herbicide or insecticide. Newspaper and cardboard, which is also known as sheet mulch. You can use layers of that for weed suppression, and also all the other benefits of mulches. Lots of times people put other kinds of mulch like leaves or grass clippings or bark on top of the cardboard or newspaper, which makes it look better. There's also an organic kind of mulch that's used sometimes, and it's cocoa bean hulls, which I've actually never seen, but I'm sure that they smell really good. I think I have heard that. Also, almond hulls and walnut hulls are used, mainly on pathways. Another kind of organic material that can be used is manure, but you definitely don't want to use fresh manure because it can burn plants. So you want to make sure that it's really well composted. The inorganic mulches, such as rocks and pea gravel and crushed gravel, are good to use on walkways You really don't want to use stones or rocks around trees and shrubs right up close to those plants because they won't retain moisture and they definitely can heat up and make the soil underneath them even warmer. Landscape fabric and plastic are good to use for weed suppression, and you mainly want to put those. You can use them on pathways, but you can also put them around plants. We have landscape fabric or weed control fabric out in our demonstration garden, and it's covered with bark mulch, which makes it look better. Some people might get confused sometimes between compost and mulch, and compost is actually a mixture of decomposed organic matter, and you can actually use compost as a mulch and it will break down and improve your soil. One thing that people need to be aware of is that you don't want to over mulch. So usually between 1 to 4 inches, 2 to 4 inches is a good amount of mulch to be using around your plants. And in conclusion, I just want to say that any mulch is better than none.
Thank you, Bonnie.
You're welcome.
Penny, tell us about yourself.
Well, I am a 25-year Colusa County resident, and I've been a master gardener for about 7 years. My daughter will be 43 next week, and I don't know what else to tell you right offhand. I raise sheep, I have horses, I have 10 acres out in the country, and a great big garden.
One thing Penny didn't mention is that at our demonstration garden, the tomatoes are in cages, and that was Penny's idea because that's what she does at her garden.
And my tomatoes are now 6 feet tall and spilling out the top of their...
And so are they at the at the demo garden.
It seems to work pretty well.
It does. Penny, give us some water-saving tips.
Well, I put together some general tips for dealing with drought in your landscape. First and foremost, I would say protect your trees. Trees give you shade, which cools your landscape and keeps your home cooler, requires less expensive air conditioning, and heaven forbid you lose a tree to drought. Having them removed is very expensive, and I can say that from personal experience. It wasn't a dead tree due to drought, but it had to go. And having replacements grow up into that space, if you lose one, can take a long time. So you lose all that shade for all that time. So how to keep your trees happy? Probably be sure they get enough water. Use soaker hoses laid in a spiral around the tree, starting a foot or two from the trunk and going out at least to the drip line, maybe every 18 inches or so. You have to let the drip line run long enough to actually soak the root zone, not just the first 2 or 3 inches. You want to be able to poke down with a shovel or a rod and figure out that the water got down a couple of feet. And that may take a couple, 3 hours. It might take all night. Depends on your soil. Young trees will probably need this weekly. Mature trees, maybe once a month, but it depends on the type of the tree. Redwoods are particularly vulnerable because their natural home is on the coast, where they don't get rain even in the summertime, but they get lots of fog and drizzle and humidity, which makes up for the difference in the moisture. And they just don't like our hot Central Valley summers. Next, I'd say protect your foundation plantings, your basic shrubs. This would contribute to the cooling in your yard, and I recommend a two-pronged attack. First, install drip irrigation or use soaker hoses, so you put the water where it's needed and not where it's not. These methods also minimize the evaporation that you would get when you're using sprinklers, but you also need to be sure to run your system often enough and long enough so that your plants actually get enough water. Next, I would say use mulch. Mulch is your friend. It goes on top of your drip line or your soaker hoses. Needs to be 4 inches deep to do a really good job. Sometimes you put a layer of those 2-inch chunks on the bottom and it looks nice, but the moisture evaporates real quickly. Actually, the finer the better is my recommendation. My absolute favorite is what I call barn sweepings. Yep, the manure and shavings from my horse stalls and the pelleted manure from my sheep paddock make great mulch. And you get the added benefit of all that free fertilizer that's in there. I have friends who come and gather it up by the toterful to take it home and put it in their gardens and their landscapes. You can also get free manure and shavings at boarding stables, and they'll probably even load it for you just to get rid of it, because it does mound up quickly when you got lots of horses in the barn. and it doesn't smell much after the first day or two. An added benefit to the barn sweepings is it contributes greatly to your soil health. The earthworms and soil microbes and things just love that stuff, and it turns into the greatest compost there ever was. I put 12 inches or more on my garden all winter, and in the spring, I don't have to rototill. I just get out the rake and rake in my seeds, rake in my rows, and it's done. Third, I would say what to do about lawns during drought. My answer was really easy. I quit watering my front lawn, covered it with chips from when they took down my trees, and I no longer have to mow one or water it. And picking up the dog poop is way easier now, too. I have some little annual bulbs that have naturalized and come up through the chips, and I think I'll put some daffodils out there, too, in the future, just because they look nice. And it was really easy to pull a few sprouts of grass as they came up through the chips. That was not too bad. Pre-emergent spray would have helped, too, but I was just too cheap to use any. Tree services love people who want their chips. It saves them the fuel and manpower having to haul a load someplace and then probably having to pay to dump it wherever they're going. I stopped a PG&E crew one day. They were taking down some eucalyptus trees, and I said, "Do you need a place to dump that stuff?" And they said, "Yeah!" They were thrilled. And so they came and dumped it in my driveway. If you do this, though, be sure there's no oleander in the load. The guys should know what an oleander bush is, because oleander's poisonous, and I found out that as few as 6 leaves can kill a horse. It's that poisonous. Rather than going to something like chips, you could replace your lawn with ground covers that require very little water, or with desert-like low-water landscapes. This depends on how much you actually use your lawn. Most ground covers can take a little traffic, but not regular use like if you have kids. Some of the more lush-looking ones probably take as much water as lawn, so do your homework before you take the plunge. If you hardly ever use your lawn area, explore the look of a desert landscape. The UC Davis Arboretum has some lovely examples. The agaves and cactus and natural grasses and other desert natives can be really striking. Remember, too, that removing an established lawn and replacing it with other landscaping, including a different irrigation system that landscape will require, can be a lot of hard work and money. However, if you love lawns, and a lot of people do, you can do several things to minimize your water use. First, mow less often and let the grass grow taller. This helps prevent water evaporating from the soil below. And second, when you mow, raise the mower blade as high as you can and let the clippings lay where they fall. Don't bag them. This also helps minimize evaporation, but it also puts the grass nutrients back on the soil, so you need less fertilizer. Third, water in the morning when there's usually less wind. The water can sink into the soil and be absorbed by the roots before the sun comes up and starts evaporating the moisture. Watch, however, in case your particular grass is sensitive to fungal problems. Dead patches in an otherwise green lawn are a warning sign. First, be sure you're watering the lawn evenly and that your sprinkler heads are working and adjusted properly. You can use cat food or tuna cans set around your yard to check to see that the water's going on evenly and how much is going on during your timed irrigation. Only put on as much water as absolutely necessary to keep things healthy. And fifth, be sure your water is staying on your lawn and not running down the sidewalk and into the gutter. Finally, pay attention to watering restrictions in your community. Nobody needs fines. I have no personal experience with artificial turf, but I imagine it can't last forever. So what are you going to do with all that plastic in the future? I say ick, but that's just me. So fourth, I think many people are thinking of making changes to their landscapes to minimize their water use. And here I suggest that you start small. This can be a lot of work and involve a lot of money in both materials and labor. Whenever you're planning either a new or revised landscape, start with a drawing and good old graph paper. A ruler and a pencil are your friends here. Measure the area that you want to work on and decide what your goals are for each area within that particular grouping. Are there fixed assets like trees and shrubs that will stay? Measure and mark them accordingly on the drawing. Are there trees or structures that have to be removed? Plan to get them out before too much else gets started or gets in the way. What are your goals and expected uses for the areas? Do you want a shaded gathering place? Are you thinking of a pond or a water feature or a fire pit? What kind of seating do you envision? Will you want pathways between the areas with different uses? What kind of paths work for your family? Does somebody have a disability? Are there older people in the family that might trip and fall? All of these components will influence the success of your labors. Once you've drawn out and laid out the structural components, it's time to think how plants and trees will become part of landscape. If you're not a plant person to begin with, plan to visit some public gardens or arboretums to get ideas. And take notes and pictures of what you like and what you don't. There are tours put on by garden clubs that can be really inspirational. Remember, too, that just because you saw it in a plant nursery, it's not necessarily going to work here in the valley, particularly if you saw it at a big box store. I remember working at one for a summer, and they brought in all these beautiful fuchsias, and they hung them from the beams in the west-facing part of the nursery, and the next day they were all crispy critters. They were literally fried in their baskets. They also sold a bunch of rhododendrons. Rhododendrons don't grow well around here. They grow on the coast with the redwoods. Like I say, do some homework before you pick out your plants. Get some knowledgeable help from somebody you know. Think about, do you want to screen an unsightly view? Do you want a larger evergreen tree or a shrub? Do you want to preserve a beautiful view? You might want to select plants that frame it without blocking it. The UC Davis Arboretum, your Master Gardeners, and the Sunset Garden Book are my 3 basic resources for these kinds of things. And remember, Martha Stewart did not and does not do all that gardening by herself. That kind of beautiful manicured landscape you see in her magazines took a serious budget to create and an army of gardeners to keep it looking that way inside and out, day in and day out. Be realistic about how big an individual plant will become and how long it will take to reach that size in the landscape. If you want a full look right away and don't want to wait for years for the plants to fill in, maybe count on vigorous annuals to fill in the spaces at first. Or plant 2 or 3 of your foundation plants now to fill the open space and plan to remove 1 or 2 of them as they grow to their full potential. As a good example, I have a California bay tree that I really thought I could keep as a big shrub. Nope. It really wanted to be a tree. And so it has become one. Not really where I would have put it if it were going to be a tree, but that's where it is now, and that's where it's going to stay. As you're planning this landscape use, think about water use zones. Group plants with both like water needs and similar light needs. Just because a plant is drought tolerant does not mean it wants full sun when it's 100 degrees outside. Also, young drought tolerant plants will need regular water in their first few years. You can't just plant them and walk away. Darn it. Think also about your commitment to landscape care. Are you the type that gets a kick out of mowing the lawn and blowing the leaves? Are you going to enjoy pruning hedges regularly? Are you more into the natural look? You may enjoy roses, but do you plan to deadhead them and do the yearly pruning? If you enjoy fruit trees, maybe the dwarf varieties will be plenty for your family's needs and involve less cleanup of excess fruit. Or do you just want to sit back with a cup of coffee and a glass of wine and enjoy the scenery? I think that's more of us than you might realize. So that's kind of my little spiel in a bucket. What do you think?
Thank you, Penny. Now, personally, barn shavings, I think they smell awesome. But doesn't matter if it's sheep or horses. They smell good.
Well, the sheep ones, by the time they get to the bucket and out to the garden, they're so dry, they have absolutely no aroma to start with.
Yeah.
They're like little rabbit pellets.
So, Penny gave you lots of options on saving water. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to do it.
Upcoming Master Gardener events in Colusa County. Come and visit our demonstration garden in Williams at the Education Village. We planted 8 different varieties of tomatoes. This way you can compare each variety. We also have several varieties of tomatillos, basil, sweet peppers, and hot peppers. We're having an event at the demonstration garden on July 31st at 9 a.m. You can taste tomatoes, pick some peppers, and ask lots of questions. We hope to see you there. We are also at the Arbuckle Farmers Market every Wednesday night, and we are also at the Williams Flea Market the first Friday of every month. And in August, it will be August 6th. For more information or insightful tips and gardening hints, visit the Master Gardeners of Colusa County on Facebook or visit our website, cecolusa.ucanr.edu. Remember to sign up for our monthly gardening newsletter. A link will be in the notes of the show. Do you have a gardening question? Send an email to glhernandez@ucanr.edu. Cynthia, Danny, Bonnie, and Penny, thank you for joining me on another episode of our podcast. Thank you for listening to A Garden Runs Through It, a podcast of the UC Master Gardener Program of Colusa County, produced by RadioColusa.com. Until next time, keep your hands dirty.